Denzel Johnson had always been a quiet, hard-working man. He wasn't the type to seek attention or cause trouble. That day, though, he found himself standing in a small-town courtroom, feeling more exposed than ever before. The room was dimly lit, with rows of wooden benches that creaked whenever someone shifted their weight. Denzel stood at the center of it all, his heart pounding like a drum as he faced Judge Harold Whitaker, a man known for his stern demeanor and sharp tongue. Case seemed simple enough, or so Denzel thought. A few weeks earlier, while walking home from work, he'd heard faint whimpers coming from a nearby alley. Following the sound, he discovered an injured dog lying on the ground, its leg caught under some debris. Without hesitation, Denzel climbed over a short fence to reach the animal, freeing it gently and wrapping it in his jacket. He called the local animal shelter, ensuring the dog would receive care. What Denzel didn't know was that the property he'd stepped onto belonged to a wealthy businessman who didn't take kindly to trespassers, even those with good intentions. When the police arrived, they questioned Denzel briefly but let him go after confirming his story. However, the businessman pressed charges anyway, claiming Denzel had no right to enter his land. Denzel couldn't believe what was happening. All he'd done was try to help an innocent creature in pain. But now, here he was, standing in court, trying to explain himself to a judge who barely looked up from his papers. Judge Whitaker adjusted his glasses and peered down at Denzel from his elevated bench. His expression was unreadable, almost cold. "Mr. Johnson," he began, his voice carrying a tone of authority that made Denzel feel even smaller. "You admit to climbing over the fence and entering private property without permission, correct?" Denzel nodded nervously. "Yes, Your Honor, but—" "No buts!" Judge Whitaker interrupted sharply, slamming his gavel against the desk for emphasis. The sound echoed through the room, making Denzel flinch. "You broke the law. It doesn't matter why you did it. The fact remains that you trespassed." "But I was helping an injured dog." Denzel tried again, his voice trembling slightly. "It was suffering. I couldn't just leave it there." "Judge." Whitaker leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. For a moment, he simply stared at Denzel, his eyes narrowing as if studying him closely. Then, with a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, he said something that sent a chill down Denzel's spine. "Young man, this isn't your country. If you can't follow our rules, maybe you should go back to Africa." The words hit Denzel like a punch to the gut. He froze, unsure if he'd heard correctly. The courtroom fell silent, the air thick with tension. Even the bailiff seemed uncomfortable, shifting awkwardly in his uniform. Denzel glanced around, hoping someone would speak up, but everyone avoided his gaze. They acted as if nothing unusual had happened, as if the judge's cruel remark was perfectly acceptable. For a moment, Denzel felt paralyzed. His mind raced with thoughts of anger, shame, and disbelief. How could someone in a position of power say such a thing? He clenched his fists tightly, forcing himself to stay calm. Losing his temper wouldn't help. He needed to focus. Taking a deep breath, he looked directly at Judge Whitaker and replied, "Your Honor, I may not be perfect, but I came here today to tell the truth. And the truth is, I didn't mean any harm. I was only trying to do the right thing." His response earned him another dismissive wave from the judge. "Save your speeches for someone who cares," Whitaker snapped. "This court doesn't have time for sob stories." With that, he banged his gavel once more and declared Denzel guilty of trespassing, sentencing him to pay a hefty fine. As Denzel left the courthouse, his head hung low. He couldn't shake off the sting of the judge's words. People often told him to ignore insults, to let them roll off his back like water. But this was different. This wasn't just an insult. It was a reminder of how unfair life could be when people judged you based on where you came from, rather than who you were. That night, Denzel sat alone in his tiny apartment, replaying the events of the day in his mind. He thought about the dog he'd saved, the way its tail wagged weakly when he picked it up. He thought about the businessman who refused to show compassion, the judge who dismissed him so callously, and the crowd that stayed silent when he needed support the most. Slowly, a fire began to burn inside him. Denzel realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about proving that he, and others like him, deserved respect, no matter what anyone said. With newfound determination, Denzel decided to fight back, not with violence or hatred, but with knowledge. He vowed to learn everything he could about the law, to understand the system that had failed him so he could turn it into a weapon for justice. Little did he know, this decision would set him on a path that would change not only his life, but also the lives of countless others. And so Denzel's journey began, not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with quiet resolve. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face whatever challenges came his way. After all, sometimes the greatest victories are born out of the deepest humiliations. The days following the court hearing were some of the hardest Denzel had ever faced. He felt like a storm cloud was hanging over him, casting a shadow on everything he did. The judge's words echoed in his mind constantly, replaying themselves, like a broken record. Go back to Africa. Those 5 words gnawed at him, not because they hurt his pride, though they certainly did, but because they made him feel powerless. It was as if the entire world had turned its back on him, telling him he didn't belong. But instead of letting that feeling consume him, Denzel decided to channel it into something bigger. That's when he made a decision that would change everything. He would teach himself about the law. At first, the idea seemed ridiculous even to him. How could someone with no legal background possibly understand the complexities of the justice system? But the more he thought about it, the more determined he became. If the law had been used against him unfairly, then maybe learning how it worked would help him fight back, not just for himself, but for others who might find themselves in similar situations. Denzel started small. He visited the local library every evening after work, spending hours poring over books and articles about laws, court procedures, and famous cases. At first, the jargon confused him. Words like precedent, statute, and jurisdiction felt like a foreign language, but Denzel was patient. He took notes, highlighted important passages, and asked librarians for guidance whenever he got stuck. Slowly but surely, the pieces began to fall into place. One librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson, noticed how dedicated Denzel was. She often saw him sitting at the same table near the window, surrounded by stacks of books and papers. One day, she approached him with a gentle smile. "You're really putting in the effort, aren't you?" she said, her voice warm and encouraging. Denzel looked up, surprised. "I'm trying," he admitted. "But it's not easy." Mrs. Thompson nodded knowingly. "Nothing worth doing ever is. What brought this on, if you don't mind me asking?" He hesitated for a moment, then told her about the court case and Judge Whitaker's harsh words. As he spoke, he could see the sympathy in her eyes, but there was also admiration. When he finished, Mrs. Thompson patted his shoulder. "Don't let anyone tell you what you can or can't do," she said firmly. "If you want to learn, I'll do whatever I can to help." From that day on, Mrs. Thompson became Denzel's unofficial mentor. She recommended books, pointed him toward online resources, and even shared stories about landmark cases that had shaped the legal system. Her support gave Denzel the confidence boost he needed to keep going. He wasn't alone anymore. He had someone cheering him on, even if it was just one person. As weeks turned into months, Denzel's understanding of the law grew exponentially. He learned about constitutional rights, the importance of due process, and how judges were supposed to remain impartial. He discovered that Judge Whitaker had a reputation for being tough and sometimes downright unfair, especially when dealing with people from marginalized communities. This revelation fueled Denzel's determination even further. He realized that his experience wasn't unique. Many others had likely faced similar injustices. To test his newfound knowledge, Denzel began volunteering at a community center that offered free legal advice to low-income families. At first, he mostly observed, taking mental notes as experienced. Lawyers helped clients navigate their problems, but soon he started offering suggestions of his own. To everyone's surprise, including his own, they were often spot on. People began seeking him out specifically, trusting his insights despite his lack of formal credentials. One evening, a young mother named Lisa approached him, tears streaming down her face. She explained that her landlord was threatening to evict her and her 2 children because she was late paying rent. Denzel listened carefully, asking questions to clarify the situation. Then, using what he'd learned, he advised her on how to respond. He showed her where to find tenant rights information and even helped her draft a letter to the landlord explaining her circumstances. A week later, Lisa returned to thank him, beaming with relief. The eviction notice had been withdrawn. Stories like Lisa's reinforced Denzel's belief that the law could be a tool for good if used correctly. But they also reminded him of the challenges ahead. Not everyone had access to the resources or support they needed to stand up for themselves. That's when he decided to take things a step further. He filed a motion to appeal his own case, arguing that Judge Whitaker's behavior during the trial had been biased and unprofessional. It was a bold move, especially for someone without a law degree, but Denzel knew he had nothing to lose. Preparing for the appeal consumed every waking moment of his life. He spent nights hunched over his kitchen table, surrounded by piles of documents and sticky notes. His friends and family noticed the change in him. They saw how focused and driven he had become, and they rallied around him, offering encouragement and assistance wherever they could. One friend, Marcus, even helped him practice presenting his arguments aloud, pretending to be a skeptical judge while Denzel responded with calm precision. Despite the long hours and sleepless nights, Denzel never lost sight of why he was doing this. Every time he felt overwhelmed, he reminded himself of the dog he'd saved, the one that had sparked this whole chain of events. That little animal had unknowingly set him on a path toward something greater. And now, it wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about proving that anyone, no matter their background or circumstances, could rise above adversity and make a difference. By the time the date of the appeal hearing arrived, Denzel was as prepared as he could possibly be. He had gathered evidence, researched precedents, and crafted a compelling argument. More importantly, he had found a sense of purpose that went beyond himself. No matter what happened next, he knew he had already won in one crucial way. He had refused to let bitterness or despair define him. Instead, he had transformed pain into power, humiliation into hope. As he walked into the courthouse for the second time, Denzel carried himself differently. Gone was the nervous man who had stood before Judge Whitaker months earlier. In his place was someone stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever lay ahead. The journey wasn't over yet, but Denzel knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The day of the appeal hearing arrived, and Denzel woke up earlier than usual. He hadn't slept much the night before, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. For weeks, he had been preparing for this moment, reading case law, studying legal procedures, and rehearsing his arguments until they were etched into his memory. But no amount of preparation could calm the butterflies in his stomach as he got ready to face Judge Whitaker again. Denzel dressed carefully that morning, choosing a sharp navy blue suit and a crisp white shirt. He wanted to look professional, confident, and respectful, not just for himself but for everyone who might one day hear his story. As he tied his tie in front of the mirror, he caught a glimpse of his reflection. The man staring back at him looked different from the person who had stood nervously in court months ago. His eyes held a quiet determination now, a spark that hadn't been there before. Denzel nodded at his reflection, silently reminding himself why he was doing this. When he arrived at the courthouse, Denzel noticed how much busier it was compared to his first appearance. Reporters lingered outside, cameras slung over their shoulders, while curious onlookers whispered among themselves. Word had spread about the young man who was challenging a judge's ruling without a lawyer. Some people were skeptical, dismissing him as naive or foolish. Others admired his courage, rooting for the underdog. Denzel ignored the chatter, focusing instead on the task at hand. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt tense. Unlike the small, dingy room where he'd faced Judge Whitaker initially, this space was larger and more formal. 3 judges sat behind a long bench, their expressions unreadable. To Denzel's dismay, Judge Whitaker was among them. The sight of the man sent a shiver down his spine, but he forced himself to stay composed. This wasn't about revenge or proving Whitaker wrong. It was about justice. As Denzel took his seat, he glanced around the room. A few familiar faces gave him encouraging smiles. Mrs. Thompson, the librarian who had supported him from the beginning, Marcus, his friend who had helped him practice, and Lisa, the young mother whose eviction case he had assisted with. Their presence reminded him that he wasn't alone. He carried not only his own hopes but also the hopes of those who believed in him. The proceedings began with the presiding judge, a stern-looking woman with silver hair, asking both sides to present their cases. The prosecution went first, arguing that Denzel's original conviction should stand because he had clearly violated the law by trespassing. They dismissed his intentions as irrelevant, insisting that rules were rules. Denzel listened intently, taking mental notes and waiting for his turn. When it was finally his chance to speak, Denzel rose slowly, smoothing his jacket as he stepped forward. His palms were sweaty, but his voice remained steady. "Your Honors," he began, addressing the panel respectfully, "I am here today not to argue against the importance of laws but to highlight the necessity of fairness and humanity within the justice system." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Yes, I entered private property without permission. But my actions were motivated by compassion, not malice. I saw an injured animal suffering and acted to alleviate its pain. In doing so, I inadvertently broke a rule. But does breaking a rule always equate to guilt? Or should we consider intent and context?" Denzel then launched into a detailed explanation of the legal principles that supported his argument. He cited precedents, where courts had ruled in favor of individuals who broke minor laws to prevent greater harm. He referenced statutes that emphasized proportionality in punishment, arguing that fining him heavily for saving a dog's life was excessive and unjust. Each point he made was backed by evidence, showing how thoroughly he had prepared. But Denzel didn't stop there. He turned his attention to Judge Whitaker's conduct during the original trial, pointing out specific instances where the judge had shown bias. "Your Honor," he said, looking directly at Whitaker, "when you told me to go back to Africa, you did more than insult me. You undermined the very foundation of our justice system, which is built on equality and impartiality. No one should be judged based on their race or accent, not in this courtroom, not anywhere." The room fell silent. Even the judges seemed taken aback by Denzel's boldness. Judge Whitaker shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding eye contact. Denzel, however, remained poised, speaking with clarity and conviction. He knew this was his moment to shine, to prove that he wasn't just some ordinary citizen fighting for himself. He was someone who understood the law deeply enough to challenge those who wielded it unfairly. To strengthen his case, Denzel presented documents highlighting other instances where Judge Whitaker had displayed similar behavior. These weren't mere accusations. They were facts supported by transcripts and witness testimonies. Denzel explained how such actions eroded public trust in the judiciary, making it harder for marginalized communities to seek justice. By the time he finished, the room buzzed with murmurs of approval. The judges asked him several questions, probing his knowledge and testing his resolve. Denzel answered each one thoughtfully, demonstrating not only his grasp of the law, but also his ability to think critically under pressure. At one point, the presiding judge leaned forward slightly, her expression softening as she listened to him. It was a small gesture, but it gave Denzel hope. By the end of the hearing, Denzel felt drained but satisfied. He had given everything he had, leaving no stone unturned. Whether the judges ruled in his favor or not, he knew he had done his best. As he walked out of the courtroom, reporters swarmed him, eager to hear his thoughts. Denzel smiled politely, but declined to comment, saying only, "Justice will decide." That night, Denzel returned home exhausted but proud. He replayed the day's events in his mind, reliving every argument, every question, every moment of triumph. He realized something profound. This wasn't just about winning or losing anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against you. And in doing so, he had become more than just a man seeking justice. He had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that anyone could rise above adversity with hard work and determination. The days following the appeal hearing felt like an eternity for Denzel. He tried to keep himself busy, throwing himself into his routine, working during the day, studying law at night, and helping others whenever he could. But no matter how hard he worked, his mind kept drifting back to the courtroom. Had he said enough? Were his arguments strong enough to sway the judges? Every knock on the door or ring of the phone made him jump, half expecting news about the verdict. Finally, 2 weeks later, the letter arrived. It was a formal notice from the court, informing him of the decision. Denzel's hands trembled as he tore open the envelope, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear himself think. The words on the page blurred together as his eyes scanned them quickly. Then suddenly, it hit him. The appellate court had ruled in his favor. Denzel read the document again, slower this time, letting each sentence sink in. The judges had overturned his conviction, citing multiple errors in Judge Whitaker's handling of the case. They noted that while trespassing was indeed against the law, the circumstances surrounding Denzel's actions warranted leniency. More importantly, they condemned Judge Whitaker's behavior, stating that his remarks were unbecoming of a judicial officer and violated principles of impartiality and fairness. A wave of relief washed over Denzel, followed by a surge of triumph. He wanted to shout, to jump, to celebrate, but instead he sat quietly clutching the letter in his hands. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was validation. Validation that he had been right all along, that his fight hadn't been in vain. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, feeling the weight lift off his shoulders. Word of the ruling spread quickly. Local newspapers picked up the story, praising Denzel's determination and legal acumen. Social media erupted with messages of support, calling him an inspiration and a hero. Reporters flocked to his doorstep, eager to interview him. At first, Denzel hesitated. He didn't want attention. He simply wanted justice. But then he realized this was an opportunity to share his story, to shed light on the systemic issues he'd faced, and to encourage others to stand up for themselves. During one particularly memorable interview, a journalist asked him how he managed to master the law so thoroughly without formal training. Denzel smiled, thinking back to the countless hours spent poring over books in the library. "I didn't have a choice," he replied honestly. "When someone tells you that you don't belong, you have two options: believe them or prove them wrong. I chose the latter." His humility struck a chord with people across the country. Calls poured in from strangers thanking him for giving them hope. Parents told him they were sharing his story with their children as an example of perseverance. Lawyers reached out, offering mentorship and advice. Even Mrs. Thompson, the librarian who had supported him from the start, called to congratulate him, her voice choked with emotion. "You've done something remarkable, Denzel," she said. "Never forget that." But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when news broke about Judge Whitaker. Following the appellate court's condemnation, Whitaker faced disciplinary action from the State Bar Association. An investigation was launched into his past rulings, uncovering a pattern of biased behavior. Though Whitaker denied any wrongdoing, public pressure mounted and he eventually resigned from his position in disgrace. For Denzel, this wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. Justice, he believed, wasn't just about winning cases. It was about ensuring that those in power acted fairly and responsibly. Despite the newfound fame, Denzel remained grounded. He knew the journey wasn't over. Winning the appeal was a significant milestone, but it was only the beginning of what he hoped to achieve. Inspired by the support he'd received, he decided to take the next step, pursuing a formal education in law. With the help of scholarships and donations from well-wishers, he enrolled in night classes at a nearby university. Balancing work, studies, and his volunteer efforts wasn't easy, but Denzel thrived on the challenge. Each lecture, assignment, and exam brought him closer to his goal of becoming a licensed attorney. As he progressed through his studies, Denzel continued to advocate for justice reform. He spoke at community events, sharing his experiences and urging others to speak out against discrimination and inequality. He collaborated with local organizations to provide free legal resources to underserved populations. And he never stopped, learning, constantly seeking ways to improve himself and make a difference. One evening, after a long day of classes, Denzel found himself reflecting on how far he'd come. Just a year ago, he had been a man humiliated in court, told he didn't belong. Now he was a symbol of resilience, inspiring countless others to fight for what was right. The transformation was staggering, even to him. Yet, as proud as he was of his accomplishments, he knew there was still work to be done. The system that had failed him once wouldn't change overnight, but with persistence and passion, he believed real progress was possible. That night, as he sat at his desk reviewing notes for an upcoming exam, Denzel felt a deep sense of purpose. He thought about the dog he had saved, the small act of kindness that had set everything in motion. He thought about Judge Whitaker's cruel words and how they had pushed him to rise above. Most of all, he thought about the future, not just his own, but the future of everyone who might benefit from his efforts. For Denzel, the courtroom wasn't just a place where laws were debated and decisions made. It was a battlefield where battles for equality and fairness were fought every day. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, he was ready to continue fighting, ready to inspire others, and ready to turn pain into purpose. Because sometimes the greatest victories are born not from privilege or power, but from the unwavering belief that justice is worth fighting for. Denzel's journey didn't stop with the appellate court's ruling or Judge Whitaker's resignation. If anything, those victories only fueled his determination to keep pushing forward. He knew that one win, no matter how significant, wasn't enough to fix the larger issues within the justice system. The more he studied law and worked with underserved communities, the clearer it became. Systemic injustice was a deeply rooted problem that required persistent effort to dismantle. Denzel vowed to dedicate his life to this fight, not just for himself but for everyone who felt voiceless. Balancing work, school, and advocacy wasn't easy, but Denzel approached every challenge with the same focus and resilience that had brought him this far. His nights were long, filled with textbooks, highlighters, and endless cups of coffee. During the day, he juggled his job at a local warehouse while volunteering at community centers, offering free legal advice to people who couldn't afford lawyers. At first, many doubted whether someone without formal credentials could truly make a difference. But Denzel proved them wrong time and again, using his growing knowledge of the law to help individuals navigate difficult situations. One case stood out in particular, a young single father named Marcus, not to be confused with Denzel's friend, who was facing eviction after losing his job due to an injury. Marcus had been served papers by his landlord, who claimed he hadn't paid rent for 3 months. Desperate and unsure of what to do, Marcus turned to Denzel for help. After reviewing the documents and asking a few key questions, Denzel discovered that the landlord had failed to follow proper procedures when issuing the eviction notice. Armed with this information, Denzel guided Marcus on how to respond, filing a counterclaim that forced the landlord to negotiate rather than pursue eviction. In the end, Marcus was allowed to stay in his apartment, giving him the stability he needed to recover and rebuild his life. Stories like Marcus's reinforced Denzel's belief that the law could be a powerful tool for good, if used correctly. But they also highlighted the barriers many people faced when trying to access justice. For every success story, there were countless others where individuals simply gave up because they didn't know their rights or couldn't afford representation. This realization inspired Denzel to think bigger. He began organizing workshops in low-income neighborhoods, teaching residents about tenant rights, employment discrimination, and other common legal issues. Attendance grew steadily as word spread about the man who had beaten the system and was now helping others do the same. As his reputation grew, so did opportunities to amplify his message. Local news outlets invited him to speak on panels about racial bias in the justice system. Community leaders sought his input on policy changes aimed at making courts more accessible. Even universities started reaching out, asking him to share his experiences with students. Denzel embraced these opportunities, knowing they gave him a platform to advocate for meaningful change. Yet, through it all, he remained humble, always, reminding people that he was still learning too. Years passed, and Denzel's hard work began paying off in ways he never imagined. He graduated top of his class from law school, earning accolades for his academic achievements and commitment to public service. On graduation day, surrounded by friends, family, and supporters, Denzel delivered a heartfelt speech. "This isn't my victory," he said, looking out at the crowd. "It belongs to everyone who believed in me, everyone who stood by me, and everyone who reminded me that I belonged, even when the world tried to tell me otherwise." With his degree in hand, Denzel passed the bar exam on his first attempt, officially becoming a licensed attorney. It was a moment of immense pride, not just for him but for everyone who had witnessed his journey. From being humiliated in court to standing before judges as a respected legal professional, Denzel's transformation was nothing short of extraordinary. Yet he refused to let success go to his head. Instead, he channeled his energy into building a career focused on civil rights and justice reform. Denzel joined a prestigious law firm known for its commitment to representing marginalized communities. There, he worked tirelessly, taking on high-profile cases that challenged discriminatory practices and exposed flaws in the justice system. One of his earliest clients was a group of factory workers who had been denied overtime pay despite working grueling hours. Their employer argued that they were independent contractors, not employees, and therefore ineligible for benefits. Denzel meticulously researched labor laws, finding loopholes in the company's argument and presenting overwhelming evidence in court. When the judge ruled in favor of the workers, awarding them back pay and damages, the entire courtroom erupted in applause. For Denzel, it was another reminder of why he had chosen this path. But perhaps the most poignant moment came years later, when Denzel found himself standing in the very same courtroom where Judge Whitaker had once humiliated him. This time, however, Denzel wasn't the defendant. He was the lead counsel in a landmark civil rights case against a city official accused of racial profiling. As he delivered his opening statement, his eyes scanned the room, lingering briefly. On the spot where he had once stood nervously, the irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was years later, commanding respect and wielding the law as a force for good. The trial lasted weeks, drawing national attention as experts weighed in on its potential impact. Denzel left no stone unturned, presenting airtight arguments, backed by mountains of evidence. His cross-examinations were razor-sharp, leaving opposing witnesses flustered and unsure of how to respond. By the time closing arguments rolled around, it was clear that Denzel had won over not only the jury, but also the public. When the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted in cheers. Outside, crowds gathered, holding signs that read "Justice Prevails" and chanting Denzel's name. In the aftermath of the trial, Denzel became a household name. Media outlets dubbed him a legal trailblazer, praising his ability to turn personal adversity into professional triumph. Offers poured in, from speaking engagements to book deals, but Denzel stayed true to his mission. He continued fighting for the underdog, using his platform to shine a light on issues others preferred to ignore. Whether it was advocating for affordable housing, challenging police misconduct, or pushing for reforms in sentencing guidelines, Denzel remained steadfast in his commitment to justice. Looking back on his journey, Denzel often reflected on how everything had come full circle. The humiliation he had endured in that small-town courtroom had sparked a fire within him, driving him to prove not only to the world but also to himself that he was capable of greatness. Along the way, he had inspired countless others to believe in themselves too. His story was a testament to the power of resilience, the importance of education, and the enduring value of standing up for what is right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. For Denzel, the fight was far from over. Injustice existed everywhere, and there would always be battles to fight. But he faced the future with hope, knowing that every step he took brought him closer to creating a fairer, more equitable world. And though the road ahead might be long and difficult, He walked it with confidence, armed with the knowledge that even the smallest acts of courage could spark monumental change. Years had passed since Denzel first walked into that small-town courtroom, a nervous and humiliated man. Now, standing in the same room as lead counsel for a high-profile civil rights case, he felt like a completely different person. The air buzzed with anticipation as reporters packed the benches, cameras flashing and pens scribbling furiously. This wasn't just another trial. It was a defining moment, one that would shape how people viewed justice and equality in the legal system. For Denzel, it was also deeply personal. He could still picture himself years ago, trembling under Judge Whitaker's harsh words, feeling powerless against the weight of prejudice. Today, however, he carried no fear, only purpose. The case centered around allegations of systemic racial profiling by a city police department. A group of residents had filed a lawsuit claiming they were unfairly targeted during routine traffic stops simply because of their race. Their stories were heartbreaking. Families torn apart, livelihoods disrupted, and trust in law enforcement shattered. When Denzel heard about the case, he knew he had to take it on. It wasn't just about winning, it was about sending a message that discrimination had no place in society, and certainly not in institutions meant to protect people. As the trial unfolded, Denzel's brilliance became undeniable. His arguments were sharp, his evidence irrefutable. He painted vivid pictures of the harm caused by biased policing, weaving together statistics, expert testimonies, and heart-wrenching personal accounts. During closing arguments, he spoke directly to the jury, his voice steady yet impassioned. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this case isn't just about these plaintiffs. It's about every person who has ever been made to feel less than human because of the color of their skin. It's about whether we, as a society, are willing to hold ourselves accountable when our systems fail." When the verdict came down, guilty, on all counts, the courtroom erupted in cheers. Tears streamed down the faces of the plaintiffs, who hugged each other tightly, overwhelmed with relief. Outside, crowds gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and chanting Denzel's name. Reporters swarmed him, eager to capture his reaction. But instead of celebrating his victory, Denzel used the opportunity to remind everyone of the work still ahead. "This is a step forward," he said, addressing the crowd. "But let's not forget that true justice requires more than one verdict. It demands constant vigilance, courage, and action from all of us." The trial cemented Denzel's status as a national figure. Invitations poured in from universities, conferences, and advocacy groups, all wanting him to share his story and insights. Yet, despite the accolades, Denzel stayed grounded. He continued working at his firm, taking on cases that others deemed too challenging or politically sensitive. Whether it was defending immigrants facing deportation, advocating for affordable housing, or challenging discriminatory hiring practices, Denzel remained committed to using his skills to uplift marginalized communities. One day, while sorting through mail at his office, Denzel came across a letter that stopped him in his tracks. It was from Lisa, the young mother whose eviction he had helped prevent years earlier. Inside was a photograph of her 2 children smiling brightly, along with a note thanking him for changing their lives. "You gave us hope when we had none," she wrote. "Because of you, my kids have a stable home and a future full of possibilities." Reading those words, Denzel felt a lump rise in his throat. Moments like this reminded him why he had chosen this path, not for fame or recognition, but to make a tangible difference in people's lives. Over time, Denzel expanded his efforts beyond individual cases. He founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing free legal resources to underserved communities. The organization offered workshops, mentorship programs, and even scholarships for aspiring lawyers from disadvantaged backgrounds. Denzel believed strongly that the next generation of advocates needed support and guidance to carry the torch of justice forward. Through the nonprofit, he inspired countless young people to pursue careers in law, showing them that their voices mattered, even if the world tried to silence them. Denzel's influence extended far beyond courtrooms and classrooms. He became a vocal advocate for policy reform, testifying before lawmakers and pushing for changes to outdated laws. One of his proudest achievements was helping draft legislation aimed at reducing racial disparities in sentencing. The bill faced fierce opposition, with critics arguing it would weaken the justice system. But Denzel refused to back down, presenting data and real-life examples that highlighted the devastating impact of unequal treatment. When the governor finally signed the bill into law, Denzel stood alongside activists and community leaders, knowing their collective efforts had paved the way for lasting change. Despite his success, Denzel never forgot where he came from or the lessons he had learned along the way. Every so often he visited the library where Mrs. Thompson had first encouraged him during his darkest days. She was older now, her hair streaked with gray, but her smile remained as warm as ever. "You've done amazing things, Denzel," she told him during one visit. "But don't stop dreaming bigger." Her words stuck with him. While Denzel had accomplished so much, he knew there was always more to do. Justice, after all, wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And though the road might be long and fraught with challenges, Denzel embraced it wholeheartedly. He often thought about the dog he had saved all those years ago, the incident that had set everything in motion. That tiny act of kindness had sparked a chain reaction, leading him to discover his true calling and inspiring others to find theirs. On quiet evenings, Denzel liked to sit by his window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. He reflected on how far he'd come, from a man dismissed and humiliated in court to someone respected and admired for his unwavering commitment to justice. Yet, he didn't see himself as extraordinary. To him, he was simply someone who had refused to give up, someone who had turned pain into purpose. His story served as a powerful reminder that resilience could transform even the deepest wounds into victories. It showed that no matter how daunting the obstacles, anyone could rise above them with determination and hard work. Denzel hoped his journey would inspire others to believe in themselves, to stand up for what was right, and to fight for a better future, not just for themselves, but for everyone. As he looked out at the city skyline, Denzel smiled softly. Somewhere out there, a young person was probably sitting in a library, poring over books, dreaming of making a difference. Maybe they felt discouraged, unsure if their efforts would amount to anything. If they ever doubted themselves, Denzel wanted them to remember his story. Because sometimes all it took was one spark of courage to ignite a lifetime of change. And in that moment, Denzel knew his legacy would live on. Not just in the laws he helped rewrite, but in the hearts of those he inspired to keep fighting for justice.